We're going to keep reading the short stories in Mango's Mischief and Tales of Friendship by Chitra Soundar. So our first one today is All's Well with Mango Pickles. Long ago in a faraway land, King Behema ruled a small kingdom surrounded by the magnificent hills of Himtuk. He was a kind and just ruler. He lived with his wife and his son, Prince Vira. Prince Vira studied many subjects: the arts, mathematics, science, economics, and languages, including Persian, Mandarin, and Latin. Prince Vira's best friend, Suku, was not a ruler. Suku had won the king's scholarship to study with the prince. He matched Vira's academic abilities in outdoor activities. Often, the two boys competed in sports such as wrestling, archery, and horseback riding. When classes were over for the day, Prince Vira and Suku would wander through the markets and play in the mangroves. One day during the previous summer, King Behema had been unwell. Prince Vira and Suku offered to help out with his duties, and the king had allowed them to set up a court in the palace courtyard. There, the boys listened to people's problems and solved petty disagreements. Now, the hot summer months were here once again. With no work to do on the farm and no classes, said Suku, I'm bored. Maybe we can ask Father to invite us to the dance performances in the palace, Prince Vira suggested. Please don't, said Suku. I can't sit in one place with a smile on my face for hours on end. That's my future you're describing, said Vira. What would you rather do instead? We could set up court, Suku replied. Prince Vira's eyes twinkled. What a good idea, he said with a big grin. Let's ask Father before he leaves for his hunting trip, he added, pulling Suku through the corridors. When they entered the royal chambers, they found the king's room in a flurry. Attendants were packing bags, clothes were strewn everywhere, and King Behema was pacing the floor. Is something wrong? Asked Suku. Packing is always traumatic, explained Vira. I can't find my hunting knife, said King Behema, exasperated. It should be where you left it, said the queen from behind a cupboard. She, too, was looking for something. That's not very helpful, said the king. Where did I leave it? Vira chuckled. His parents had the same conversation every time one of them left town. Did you two want something? The king asked the boys. While you're away hunting, said Prince Vira, we wondered if we could run court in the courtyard. This boy is after my throne, I tell you, said King Behema, smiling. You may run the court as long as you don't bite off more than you can chew. That saying, don't bite off more than you can chew, he's saying, be careful you don't take on more than you can handle. We never do, said Prince Vira. Thank you, Father. I wish you good fortune on your hunt. May the Vandavata, the forest nymphs, help you along the way, said Suku. As they left, a loud whoop came from the room. The king must have found his hunting knife after all. The two boys rushed out to get ready for court the following day. The next morning, a long line of people waited outside the palace to meet the king. When they found out that he was away, many of them were disappointed. Prince Vira is happy to listen to your problems, announced the guard. Some people left, but many stayed to meet with the prince. They had heard wonderful things about his court. Prince Vira summoned the first case. Two neighbors, Gapu and Dahanu, had come with a unique problem. Gapu had an old well in his overgrown garden, which he never used. Dahanu wanted to buy the well. A price was agreed on and a document was drawn up. I hereby sell just my well, situated behind my house, to Dahanu, my neighbor, for 10 silver coins. The two men signed the document, and Dahanu was happy to acquire the well in time for the summer. So what's the problem? Asked Suku. You sold him the well, he bought the well, so all's well. Prince Vira smiled at Suku's bad joke. But he couldn't figure out the cause of their disagreement either. I sold only the well, your majesty, said Gapu, not the water, so whenever Dahanu draws water from the well, he has to pay me half a silver. Suku's jaw dropped open. Who ever heard of selling a well and charging for the water? Vira looked at Suku and raised his eyebrows. What do you say to that, Dahanu? Asked Prince Vira. Why would I buy just the well, your majesty? Asked Dahanu. I need water for my garden during the summer months, but he wouldn't let me draw water from my own well unless I paid him half a silver. But you signed the document, said Gapu, waving a scroll in front of Dahanu. It clearly says, just my well. Suku reached for the scroll. What Gapu said was true. This was a tricky problem. Vira wanted to talk it over with Suku. They went for a walk. They went to the garden for a walk. Why would someone buy a well and not the water? Asked Vera. If the well was empty, he could store his pots and pans in it, suggested Suku. Or maybe he has relatives coming and they need room to stay, said Vera. Next time you come to stay, said Suku, I'll ask them to prepare the well. I'm sure you would join me too, said Vera, and maybe the well could be used as a hiding place. He was thinking about the hiding place his grandfather had made many years ago to escape from his enemies. The only trouble is, said Suku, this well is not empty. That's when Vera had an idea. Come on, let's go, he said. I know what to do. I've reached a decision, Prince Vera said, taking his seat in the courtyard. Everyone was quiet. They wanted to know how the prince would solve this tricky case. According to the document, Dahanu bought only the well, said Prince Vera, and not the water. Indeed, he should pay half a silver every time he draws water. Gapu was overjoyed. This prince is very astute, he thought. Astute means he has the ability to solve problems in a way that favors him. But, Prince Vera continued, he may have bought the well so he could use it to store his belongings. Or perhaps he wants to live in the well. Everyone was confused. As soon as the well was sold, explained Prince Vera, Gapu should have removed the water. But, Your Majesty, said Gapu. Shh, warned Suku. Prince Vera wasn't finished. Gapu should take the water out of the well immediately, or he should pay rent for storing the water in Dahanu's well. Dahanu beamed. The prince is indeed wise and just, he thought. Gapu hung his head in shame. The prince had outwitted him with his own trick. Gapu agreed not to charge Dahanu for the water, lest he should be forced to pay for keeping the water in the well. The document was amended, and the prince warned Gapu not to try such a trick again. That was a little complicated, said Vera. It's water under the bridge now, Suku giggled. Seems like neighbors are not very nice to each other in our kingdom, observed Vera. That's why I live far away from the palace, said Suku. You might not be a good neighbor. Prince Vera chuckled. But he soon stopped because the next man who came in was crying. Please, said Prince Vera, tell me your grievance. My name is Kasi, Your Majesty, said the man, and I live next door to a man named Pawan. Are you crying because your name is Kasi or because you live next door to Pawan? Asked Suku. Neither, said Kasi. I am crying because Pawan stole all my precious belongings. It seemed that neighborly feuds were not over for the day. We'll be the judges of that, said Suku. Please state your case. My mother passed away a year ago, said Kasi. I had to go to the holy city of Varanasi to perform her death ceremony. Varanasi was a long way away. It took months to get there, even on horseback. Was the ceremony completed to your satisfaction? Asked Suku. Yes, it was, replied Kasi, but before I left for Varanasi, I handed over a jar of pickles to my neighbor Pawan for safekeeping. It is important to keep pickles safe, said Prince Vera. He loved the tender mango pickles that Suku's mother made for him. He hid the jars in the royal kitchen so that he could eat the pickles all year. Actually, the jar didn't have any pickles in it, said Kasi. I filled it with all my precious belongings, my gold ring, gold chain, silver coins, even some rubies that had belonged to my mother. It's very clever, said Suku. So what is the problem? I didn't tell my neighbor that it was filled with valuables. He thought it was filled with pickles. Then what happened, asked Vera. Thinking of pickles had made his mouth water. When I came back yesterday and asked for the jar, said Kasi, Pawan returned my jar filled with pickles. My gold and silver and rubies were gone. Lemon or mango? Asked Vera. Suku nudged Vera. Was that even important? It was filled with tender mango pickles, said Kasi. He started to cry again. Every story had two sides. Prince Vera and Suku wanted to hear what Pawan had to say. Pawan was summoned to the court, but when he came before the prince, he didn't look worried. At your service, Your Majesty, he said. Your neighbor Kasi has lodged a complaint, said Suku. He claims that you stole his gold and silver. And rubies, added Prince Vera. That's totally untrue, said Pawan. I didn't steal his gold, silver, or rubies. Can you prove that? Asked Vera. Kasi gave me the jar for safekeeping before he left on his travels, said Pawan. He repeatedly said that the jar contained tender mango pickles made by his mom before she died. He wanted me to keep it safe until he returned. Vera and Suku turned to look at Kasi, who was still crying. When Kasi came back yesterday, I returned his jar of pickles, Pawan continued. You can ask him what was in the jar. The jar was filled with tender mango pickles, Your Majesty, said Kasi. He gave me pickles and he got back pickles, said Pawan. I never stole any gold or silver or rubies. Prince Vera was confused. Yet another case that looked straightforward but wasn't. Was Kasi lying about the precious stones and silver and gold inside the jar, or had Pawan stolen everything and filled the jar with pickles? It was almost lunchtime and Vera was hungry. All this talk of pickles was making him even hungrier. Let's finish this later, said Vera. I need to think about it a little longer. While the prince and his friend went to the royal dining hall, all the people waiting to see Vera were served lunch in the courtyard. As they walked, Vera said, I don't know who's lying. Maybe instead of eating here, we should go to my house for lunch, Suku suggested. My mother knows everything about pickles. That's the best idea you've had all day, said Prince Vera. He loved eating at Suku's house. Suku's mother was a wonderful cook. That day, she served them freshly made bread with spinach, potatoes, and lentils, and some fresh fish, too. How about some tender mango pickles to go with the fish? She asked. Absolutely, chimed the boys in unison. Vera bit into the fried fish and took a bite out of the tender pickled mango. Suku took a mouthful of rice mixed with the lentils, potatoes, and fish. Eat slowly, warned Suku's mother. It's so good we can't wait between mouthfuls, said Vera. Tell me about your latest case, said Suku's mother. So they did. Afterwards, she said, I don't know anything about justice, dear Vera, but I know something about pickles. Suku's mother presented them with 2 cups of tender mango pickles. This one on the right, she said, was made this time last year. Suku and Vera touched the mango pieces. They were shrunken and wrinkly. Suku bit into a piece. It was very chewy and salty. This one on the left, she said, the one you had for lunch today, was made last week. The mangoes were fresh from the trees and soaked 2 days after being picked. These pieces were bright green without wrinkles. Vera bit into one. Crunch! The pickle was crunchy and the salt had not yet soaked into it. Vera and Suku had made their way back in silence. They were both busy thinking. The court was ready for them when they reached the palace. Before they entered, Suku said, Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Maybe, said Vera. Are you thinking about crunchy pickles? Maybe. As soon as Vera settled into a seat, he said to Pawan, I want to sample the pickles in the jar. The guard placed the jar in front of the boys. The mango pieces were sloshing in the salt and chili water. Suku took out 2 pieces of mango with a ladle. The boys picked up 1 tender mango each and turned it around like they were looking at diamonds. Green. Not wrinkly at all. Let's try it, said Vera, and he bit into the piece. Suku did the same. Crunch! The mangoes were still fresh, like the ones they'd eaten for lunch. These couldn't have been mangoes from last season. That meant Pawan had removed the contents of the jar and filled it with mangoes picked this season. Pawan trembled as Vera glared at him. You cheated your neighbor and stole his property, said Vera. And you thought we didn't know about pickles, said Suku. Prince Vera confiscated all the stolen gold, silver, and rubies and returned them to Kasi. Pawan was asked to work in the kitchens, making pickles for the rest of the season. Kasi returned home, delighted that he had taken his case to the prince. Prince Vera had one more thing to do. He talked to his father's minister and recommended that the palace organize a place of safekeeping so that when people went away on long trips, they didn't have to worry about cheats and burglars. Something good for all the people would come out of something bad. This is an excellent idea, said the minister. You're surely taking after your father. Like mango, like pickle, said Suku. That's what my mother always says. So I want you to think about how Prince Vera and Suku solved these problems. What do you think about how they solved them? Hold on to that thought and you'll answer a question when we're done about how Suku and Prince Vera solved their problems. All right, our next story for today is Freezing Lakes and Missing Crows. Prince Vera enjoyed running the court with Suku in the king's absence, even if they had to run it in the courtyard. He and Suku always had a good time. But after a week of listening to people complaining about family, friends, and neighbors, the boys wanted a break. Let's go to the riverbank, said Suku. We could jump into the water and catch fish. And then we could go to the market and buy some palm fruits, said Prince Vera. But just as they were changing out of their formal court attire, they heard news that King Bahima was on his way back home with a special guest. A welcome party was preparing to receive the king at the edge of the forest where he was camping that night. The river will still be there tomorrow, said Vera. Let's go and meet Father. So the boys set off with the king's entourage. They took lots of food, fresh water, and juice, and a band to play music. The welcome party reached the king's camp by dusk. The king was overjoyed that Vera and Suku had come too. He was eager to hear about their week running their own court. Who's your guest, Father? Asked Vera. Do you want to meet him now? Asked the king. I thought it could wait until morning. I'm curious, said Vera. Don't say I didn't warn you, said King Bahima, and he sent word to the other tent. Within a few minutes, the king and the two boys were invited there. Vera gulped when he saw who was inside. Uncle, you remember Vera, said King Bahima. Welcome, granduncle, said Prince Vera. Are you passing through? I've not visited my dear nephew in a long while, said Raja Apurva, and I have some family matters to discuss too. Oh no, thought Suku. This was the infamous uncle who handed out harsh punishments, the one who had never liked King Bahima or Prince Vera much. The palace walls were filled with gossip about Raja Apurva. Suku tried to blend in with the tent cloth. When he was introduced, Raja Apurva just raised his right eyebrow as if to let King Bahima know that Vera was not keeping good company. That night after dinner, everyone sat outside their tents and chatted under the full moon. What have you been up to? Raja Apurva asked Vera. Surely you haven't been busy studying during the hot summer weeks. We were running a court, said Prince Vera. What? Raja Apurva was surprised. Princes went on vacations in the hills during the summer. As King Bahima proudly talked about the court cases from the previous year and how Vera had been courageous and just, Raja Apurva shook his head. The prince is too young to listen to cases and bring justice to your people, he said. I have help, said Prince Vera. Suku is very clever and knows about a lot of things. Raja Apurva grunted and ignored Suku completely. The next morning, as the hunting party set off toward home, Raja Apurva lagged behind, deep in thought. He had to show his nephew that the boys were not as clever as they thought, and that a little knowledge was very dangerous. When the king and his group reached the city, people stood on either side of the road to welcome him. The square got busier and busier as more people arrived. The king stopped to talk to a few people. Vera mingled too. Caw-caw, the crows crowed. And people said, the crows are signaling the arrival of our royal guests. This was a legend they had had. Wasn't that wonderful? Asked the king. Even the crows are happy that you're here. Indeed, your visit was long overdue. I've got a headache, said Raja Apurva. Can you get someone to shoo the crows away, please? King Bahima sighed. He had been hoping to reach the palace without incident. They live here too, said King Bahima. Don't you remember the ancient stories? The crows had lived in our kingdom for centuries. Are you thinking of the people or the crows? Asked Raja Apurva. In my kingdom, we culled all the frogs that croaked at night and all the crows that dirtied my beautiful bronze statues throughout the city. What's a little white decoration? Said King Bahima, trying to bring some humor into the conversation. But Raja Apurva wasn't listening. Maybe in honor of my visit, said Raja Apurva, you should cull all the crows. Suku overheard this comment and bristled with anger. Whoever thought of culling birds and animals that lived in peace? They were as much a part of the city as the people. All night he had been angry about how Raja Apurva had ignored him or smirked at him. Now the visiting king was insulting King Bahima too. King Bahima signaled the guards to guide the procession to the palace. It wasn't the time or the place to have an argument, especially with Raja Apurva. That evening, as the king strolled in the garden, Vera and Suku joined them. A gentle breeze brought respite from the still hot sun. Caw-caw. The harsh screech of the crows irritated Raja Apurva again. I told you, he said, you've far too many crows in the capital and they disturb the royal peace. Even if you don't want to cull all of them, you should at least cull some." "How many is far too many?" asked Prince Vera. Crows and sparrows were part of the gardens. Who could think of them as a disturbance? He couldn't imagine a world without birds, butterflies, frogs, and fireflies. "How many do you have in the capital?" asked Raja Apoorva. He was sure that the prince wouldn't be able to answer the question. Vera blinked. "I don't know," he said. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, neither do you." "Why don't you count the crows in the capital?" said Raja Apoorva. "Then we can have an informed debate." Prince Vera knew this was a trap. The king was trying to make a fool out of him. Who ever heard of counting crows? Seeing Vera's hesitation, Raja Apoorva chuckled. "I knew you would accept defeat at the merest mention of hard work," he said. Suku tugged at Vera's sleeve. "Accept the challenge," he said. "We'll figure it out." "Fine," said Prince Vera. "Suku and I will count the crows by nightfall tomorrow." King Behemoth sat with his head in his hands. Maybe a vacation for the boys would have been much better, he thought. Suku stayed over at the palace that night, and the boys kept busy trying to figure out how to count the crows. "What about counting the crows in the garden and then multiplying that by the number of gardens in the city?" asked Vera. "Maybe we could go for a walk in the morning and count all the crows we see," suggested Suku. None of these ideas sounded right. They could never count all the crows in a month, let alone one day. "Perhaps we could tie a royal sign to all the crows we count," said Vera. Suku started to giggle. "Imagine us running behind crows and getting pecked," he said. "The guards would be chasing the crows too, and then the crows would poop on us." "Even if we did that," said Vera, "there would be a problem. What if a crow without a royal sign came into the royal garden?" "We would tell Raja Apoorva that this is a crow coming from another city," said Suku. Vera's eyes sparkled. Suku had saved the day again. He hugged Suku and danced around the room. "Are you going to tell me what's made you so happy?" "I've got a plan to outwit Granduncle Apoorva, and it is because of your genius." "How?" "You'll find out soon enough," said Vera. That night he slept dreaming of crows pooping on Raja Apoorva. The next morning, Vera and Suku went into town. After a long day strolling in the market, eating mangoes and drinking lassi, they returned home just in time for the meeting with the kings. "You are both covered in dust," said King Behemoth. "We've been busy counting crows," replied Prince Vera. "Really?" said Raja Apoorva. "So, did you manage to count all of them?" "We never fail," said Prince Vera. "Suku will now read out the number." Even King Behemoth was curious. How did the boys manage it? Suku pulled out a parchment from his pocket. "Drumroll, please," said Prince Vera, smiling at Suku. "We counted the crows in the gardens and markets, groves and swamps, and even the fields where the corn is being harvested," said Suku. "There are 75,325 crows in our capital city." King Behemoth wasn't sure whether to believe it or not, but Raja Apoorva was intrigued. How did they do it? Surely the number's wrong, he thought. What if I counted them and found more than 75,325 crows? "We knew you would ask that," said Prince Vera. "Crows are a very friendly species. Relatives and friends from other cities and kingdoms visit our crows. But to keep the counting accurate, we didn't count the visiting crows." "You should reward them for their efforts," said King Behemoth. Wait, said Raja Apoorva. "One more question. What if I counted and there were fewer crows than the number that you read out?" "Your Majesty," said Suku, "the crows in our capital city have families far and wide in the kingdom. Some of them must have gone visiting." King Behemoth burst out laughing. "I hereby decree that the number of crows in our city is not excessive and there is no need to call," he announced. Raja Apoorva scowled just for a second. He realized that the two boys had beaten him at his own challenge. Raja Apoorva clapped his hands and his guard brought a bag of gifts for the boys. "Well deserved," he said. "May you rule with wisdom always." A few weeks later, summer was nearing its end. The monsoon season was not far away. The winds had turned strong and cold. The visiting king was due to leave in a couple of days. As a farewell gesture, King Behemoth invited his uncle to grace the royal court. Raja Apoorva readily agreed. Prince Vera and Suku had been invited to attend too. Raja Apoorva watched the proceedings with great interest. That afternoon, the poor man was brought before the king. A poor man was brought before a king. My name is Amkar, your highness, said the man. I have never learned a trade or a skill, and I didn't go to school. Now I'm unable to find a job so that I can feed my family. King Bahima cleared his throat, but Raja Apurva spoke first. Dear nephew Bahima, he said, would you allow me to hear this case? King Bahima hesitated for a moment and then nodded. Of course, he said, we would be delighted. Veera looked at Suku and mouthed, This is not good. But what could he do? His father had to respect the wishes of his uncle. That was an unwritten rule for all nephews. Raja Apurva wasted no time. He addressed the poor man in front of him. Dear man Amkar, he said, what would you do to earn money for your family? Anything, your highness, said Amkar. How about an unpleasant job? Nothing is more unpleasant for me than listening to my baby cry with hunger, your majesty, said Amkar. I'm prepared to do anything. How do I know you're not just saying that? Asked Raja Apurva. I wish to test your words. I'll do anything, your majesty, repeated Amkar. The man's suffering moved Veera and Suku. Families should not go hungry. Many times people had come asking for money, and King Bahima would send them to the stables or the kitchens or the garden to get work. Perhaps Raja Apurva would find the man a job that would provide him with a livelihood. Raja Apurva said, This is what I want you to do. I want you to stand by the royal lake all night wearing nothing except your dhoti. A dhoti is a piece of cloth that's wrapped around the legs and your waist. So he wants the poor man Amkar to stand by the lake at night when it's cold with just the dhoti, just wrapped around his legs and his waist. Dhoti, sorry. The courtiers gasped. Summer was retreating. The night would be chilly and windy. But Amkar was desperate. He agreed to the king's test. If you succeed, said Raja Apurva, I will take you with me to my kingdom and give you a job in the palace. The court was dismissed in silence. Many people were worried for Amkar. Prince Veera and Suku knocked on King Bahima's door. Father, this is unfair, said Veera. You've got to do something about it. We cannot interfere, said the king. Amkar agreed, didn't he? If he had hesitated, I would have stepped in somehow. Your father is right, said Suku. You've got to let poor Amkar prove to the world that he would do anything for his family. But if he dies? The guards won't let that happen, said the king. The royal doctor will be on hand. Prince Veera wasn't convinced. But his father and Suku were right. They had to let Amkar try and win his fight with Granduncle, just as his father had let him count the crows. That night, the boys watched from the palace windows. Amkar arrived with no shirt and no coat. He was wearing just a tattered dhoti. He stood on the banks of the lake, watched by two guards. The moon climbed the sky, and the oil lamps in the corridors and the rooms were blown out. The palace slowly went to sleep. Amkar was shivering in the cold, but he was determined to survive the night. He tried to distract himself by counting the columns in the palace corridors. Then he counted the fireflies. The poor man was so cold that he was shaking. He tried to keep warm by rubbing his hands. He moved up and down the garden path surrounding the lake. Nothing helped. Amkar hugged himself tight and looked at the sky. Even the moon was reluctant to watch him suffer. It hid behind the clouds. It was dark except for the light that flickered on the palace tower. Amkar fixed his sight on the lamp. He imagined the flickering flame to be a raging fire. He imagined sitting before the fire and warming himself. He imagined roasting corn for his children. So mind you, this lamp is really far away. It's on top of a tower, and he's standing by a lake. Okay, so it's really far away. He's just imagining it warming him up. As the guards rubbed their hands in the cold, Amkar was smiling. He was lost in his own imagination. He forgot about the cold wind and the mist that fell around him. All he could think about was the flame on top of the tower. Slowly the moon moved away and let the sun return. At the crack of dawn, the guards took Amkar to the kitchen and gave him a warm drink and a blanket. Soon it was time to go to the court. Amkar was confident that the king would give him a job and his family's suffering would be over. He was smiling even though he was still shaking from the cold. The courtiers had gathered early. Prince Veera and Suku had taken their places too. Everyone eagerly awaited the king's arrival. Raja Apurva was surprised to see Amkar in the court. So you didn't run away? Asked the king. Why would I, Majorai? asked Amkar. I need a job. Did he have help to keep warm? The king asked a guard. No, sir, said the guard. He stood there all night in his dhoti with a smile on his face. Why were you smiling? Asked Raja Apoorva. I was gazing at the tower lamp, Your Majesty, said Amkar, and imagined it to be a raging fire. In my imagination, I was happily roasting corn in the fire for my children. Aha, said Raja Apoorva. You've had help. You were warmed by the tower lamp. You didn't complete this challenge as per the conditions I set out. Amkar was stunned. Amkar was stunned. How could the tower lamp warm him? It was so far away. King Bahima bristled in anger. He had assigned this case to his uncle and couldn't interfere without insulting him. But it troubled him that one of his own citizens was not getting a fair hearing in his court. Prince Vira and Suku, too, were outraged. How could Raja Apoorva treat the man with such callousness? Treating him with callous is just complete disregard. Just really mean and not caring. Whoever heard of a lamp so far up in the tower warming a man by the link? They had to do something. King Bahima shook his head slightly, warning them not to challenge Raja Apoorva. Amkar was sent away from the court with nothing. King Bahima retired to his chamber, sullen and angry. As soon as the court was adjourned, the boys left the palace too. What about Amkar? Asked Suku. I'm sure father will help him after granduncle has gone, said Vira. But we have to show Raja Apoorva that this is not fair, said Suku. We cannot let him leave without a lesson. I agree, said Prince Vira. I've been thinking the same thing. That afternoon, King Bahima didn't want to see Raja Apoorva. He wanted to eat with the boys. But the guards told him that Prince Vira was having lunch at Suku's house. Raja Apoorva, too, was on his own. He gloated to his guards that he had saved himself a bundle of money because Amkar was a cheat. He was proud of his judgment and proud that Prince Vira had learned a lesson in running a court. It was the final evening of Raja Apoorva's visit. The kings met in the garden for a stroll. Where is Vira? Asked King Bahima. He hasn't returned from Suku's house, Your Majesty, said the guard. Why don't we go for a ride, Uncle? Asked King Bahima. Vira must say goodbye to you. Why don't you summon him here? Asked Raja Apoorva. I thought you might like to see the city at night. Raja Apoorva agreed, and the king set off towards Suku's house. As they dismounted their horses, Suku's father came out to greet them. Welcome, Your Highnesses, he said. I welcome both of you. Where's Vira? Asked Bahima. I want to see him right now. He's been cooking lunch all day, Your Majesty, said Suku's father. Cooking all day? Asked Raja Apoorva. It's almost nightfall now. What kind of food is so special that he must cook all day? He's just cooking rice, Your Majesty, said Suku's father. Do come in. The kings were curious. Why was Prince Vira cooking in Suku's house when a big pot of rice was always ready in the royal kitchens? When they entered the kitchen, Raja Apoorva burst out laughing. A stove was lit on the floor. A pot hung from the ceiling, far away from the heat. What are you doing, dear prince? Asked Raja Apoorva. Surely you know how to cook rice. If not, do come to my palace and I will teach you personally. But I've learned this from you, said Prince Vira. Suku giggled. Raja Apoorva wasn't smiling, however. What do you mean? He demanded. You're a great monarch, Your Majesty, said Prince Vira. For you, even a tower lamp could warm a man by the lakeside. But I'm just a prince. I thought the blazing fire in the stove would heat the pot hanging just above it. That's not too much to ask, is it? King Bahima chuckled. Raja Apoorva understood the prince's subtle message. The lamp in the tower was indeed too far away to warm the man by the lakeside. Amkar wasn't trying to cheat him. The poor man was desperate, and he had been turned away. You're very wise, said Raja Apoorva. I'm humbled by the lesson you've taught me. I was wrong to dismiss Amkar for imagining the warmth from the lamp. King Bahima hugged Prince Vira and Suku. I'm proud of you both, he said. I was so troubled by the judgment all day. You've indeed brought me joy. That night, Raja Apoorva summoned Amkar and his family. They were all fed and clothed and asked to accompany the king back to his kingdom. Amkar was given a job at Raja Apoorva's palace. Amkar and his family would never go hungry again. I bid you farewell, King Bahima, said Raja Apoorva. You must bring your son and his friend to my palace next summer. As long as we don't have to count crows or cook rice, said Prince Vira, we'd be delighted. So now I want you to think about the friendship between Prince Vira and Suku. What about their friendship makes it work so well? What helps them be able to solve all these cases?